Nelson was born in a rundown little town where folks barely made ends meet and dusty roads stretched for miles without a single fancy building in sight. His family didn't have much more than a tiny shack that creaked every time the wind blew. He was just a kid when he realized life was rough. But even then he had this unstoppable spark in his eyes that said, "I'm gonna do something big someday." Whenever his parents were out working odd jobs or selling homemade goods by the roadside, Nelson would sit on the porch dreaming of the future. There were nights he'd stare at the stars, convinced he was made for something beyond the dusty streets and the flickering street lights that never seemed to stay on for long. Growing up, Nelson discovered that determination could be a stronger tool than any fancy education or big-shot connection. He learned how to hustle from the very folks who struggled alongside him, people who had to figure out new ways to feed their families when factory doors shut down. He'd run errands, chop wood, and do anything that paid a little so he could bring something home. Despite the calluses on his hands, he still held on to that sense of hope. He wasn't just a good-looking kid with rugged features, he was sharp. Some people said he had charm and grit rolled into one, and that blend of qualities made him stand out even in the most ordinary places. He knew how to talk to folks in a way that made them believe in him, and that skill proved invaluable as he got older. If anyone thought he'd always be stuck in this dusty corner of the world, they clearly hadn't met the unstoppable force named Nelson. He might have had humble beginnings, but inside he was teeming with ambition, ready to transform dust into dollars. When Nelson first left town, he had nothing but a small duffel bag and a stack of dreams tucked under his arm. It wasn't like he had an elaborate plan or a step-by-step blueprint for success. He just knew that staying put meant a life of the same old hardships he'd always known. So, with courage that sometimes felt more like blind optimism, he hopped on a rickety bus heading to the city. The cramped seats and stale air didn't bother him one bit. He was too busy picturing what life might look like if he made it big. Once he arrived, the city lights dazzled him like a never-ending carnival. Skyscrapers shot up into the clouds and the air buzzed with opportunity. Of course, nobody was waiting to roll out a red carpet. Nelson pounded the pavement, searching for any kind of work that paid a dime more than he was used to. He found it in grime-filled kitchens where he washed dishes and cleaned floors until his hands were raw. He barely slept, juggling 2 or 3 gigs at once because he was determined to climb out of poverty. Every tip or paycheck went straight into a savings jar, reminding him of the bigger goals ahead. That wasn't all, though. Nelson knew that if he wanted to move up, he couldn't just rely on elbow grease. He hit the library in between shifts, devouring books about business, sales, and negotiation. He'd watch powerful folks in expensive suits walk by, and instead of feeling intimidated, he took mental notes on how they spoke and carried themselves. Little by little, he polished off the rough edges of his small-town boy exterior. The day he negotiated his first real deal selling a line of second-hand electronics to a local shop was the day he realized just how far determination combined with a bit of polish could take him. And that was just the beginning. Before the city claimed all his time, Nelson had one more treasured piece of his old life, Amanda. She was the sweet, strong-willed girl who'd grown up a few streets away from him. They used to joke about the potholes and dusty roads of their hometown, dreaming together of a future that sparkled brighter than anything they'd ever known. Amanda had a quiet confidence, a kind of steady warmth that balanced Nelson's restless ambition. She believed in him before anybody else did, showing him that his big dreams weren't silly but something to be chased. Their love story started simple enough. They'd meet by the old diner with neon lights that flickered and hum in the background, the only spot open late in that sleepy town. She'd sip a milkshake while he rambled on about what he'd do if he ever got out. He promised he'd take her along, that he'd never forget where he came from or the people who mattered most to him. Maybe it was youthful innocence, or maybe it was genuine devotion, but in those moments, both of them believed they'd be together forever. Over time, that bond grew deeper. They talked about marriage and kids, about building a home that would stand strong against life's storms. Amanda was patient. She saw Nelson for more than his bravado and big dreams. She saw a guy who cared about making a difference. Even when she had her own doubts about leaving everything behind, she supported his desire to see beyond the town's limits. He'd look into her eyes, see her unshaken faith in him, and feel this incredible surge of possibility. In those early days, love seemed like the most valuable treasure on earth, something that could outlast any hardship, any ambition, and any sacrifice. They never imagined that greed would creep in and tear them apart. The city changed Nelson more than he realized. At first, his hustle was fueled by a pure desire to lift himself up from poverty, and it was noble enough. He told himself it was all for Amanda, for their future, for that house they'd one day fill with laughter and maybe a few pets running around the yard. But somewhere along the line, ambition morphed into greed. The more money he made, the more he craved. He got a taste of what it felt like to be respected and even feared by competitors, and he liked it a lot. With each new deal, his bank account swelled, but something else in him started shrinking. Something to do with the genuine care he once had for people. When Amanda would call, excited to share some small victory in her life, he'd find himself impatient. Her stories seemed trivial compared to the high-stakes world he was navigating, and he'd cut her off with half-hearted excuses about being too busy. She tried to be understanding, but cracks began to form in their relationship. Nelson was evolving into a man who couldn't be satisfied with just enough, even if that enough was all they really needed for a happy life. Amanda finally confronted him, saying that his hunger for wealth was overshadowing the love they'd built. Nelson brushed her off, claiming she just didn't get it. In his mind, he was doing all this to provide a better life for both of them. But the truth was that once pure drive to succeed had grown into a toxic thirst for more status, more money, more validation. And so, the distance between them widened until it snapped entirely. Their divorce was bitter, the final blow in a tragic transformation fueled by the dangerous belief that money mattered more than heart. Years later, Nelson found himself standing in a grand ballroom, music humming through the air, glittering chandeliers overhead, and every table dressed up in fine linen. It was a wedding reception so lavish it could have been mistaken for an A-list Hollywood event. The venue was packed with the city's elite, big-name business moguls, celebrities, and anyone who thrived on being seen in the right circles. Nelson, sporting a perfectly tailored suit, looked like he belonged there, a far cry from the dusty town he once called home. As he walked through the crowd, shaking hands with power players and exchanging hollow pleasantries, he couldn't help but remember where he started. He glanced at the perfectly arranged floral centerpieces and thought about how his mom used to grow wildflowers outside their shack, placing them in a chipped vase to brighten the gloom. He remembered the times when just having a warm meal felt like a miracle. Now he was so deep in a world of opulence that he barely recognized himself. But this wedding had a particular significance. It was for a business partner's daughter, Tori, someone connected to a wealthy tycoon whose influence Nelson relied on. Attending this event wasn't merely social, it was strategic. He had to show up, look polished, and maintain his reputation as the self-made entrepreneur who never misses an opportunity. Yet, despite all the glitter and luxury, a nagging thought kept tugging at him. Was this really the pinnacle of success, or was it just a stage set up to mask emptiness? He swallowed that worry and dove into the festivities, wearing his best smile. Chatting with guests, sampling gourmet dishes, and offering congratulatory words, Nelson was the picture of refined grace. No one else could see the faint flicker of unease hidden behind his confident eyes, a restlessness whispering that maybe he traded something priceless for these fleeting moments of grandeur. Nelson stood next to an ice sculpture shaped like a pair of doves, an extravagant centerpiece that fit right in with the luxurious theme. He felt a wave of applause as the newlyweds danced their first dance in the center of the room. Everyone around him seemed dazzled by the spectacle. The bride's designer gown, the groom's custom tux, and the never-ending supply of top-shelf champagne. Yet, in the midst of it all, Nelson couldn't shake the sense that he was an actor on a stage, performing a role he'd long since memorized. He thought about his early ambitions, how they were once fueled by love and hope. Back then, success meant having enough money so nobody he loved had to struggle for basic needs. But over the years, that dream became overshadowed by his drive to be the biggest, the best, and the richest. He wasn't naive. He knew that part of his status came from projecting an image of effortless success. But that image was just that, an image, a perfect illusion that looked impressive to onlookers but felt hollow on the inside. Amid the laughter and clinking glasses, Nelson remembered the moments he shared with Amanda. The way she'd smile at his corny jokes, the warmth of her hand in his, and the comforting sense of belonging. He'd left that all behind, convinced that his path to greatness left no room for sentimentality. But now, as he gazed around at faces that celebrated him for what he owned rather than who he was, he realized something critical was missing. That something gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. The ghost of a feeling that maybe the cost of his climb was steeper than he ever intended to pay. A burst of camera flashes snapped him out of his trance. He raised his glass in a toast, once again playing the part. In that moment, He was painfully aware that while everyone else might see him as a symbol of success, he felt more like a lonely soul wearing a mask he couldn't remove. Nelson was on his way back from the open bar, a chilled drink in hand, when he spotted a figure across the room that made his heart freeze. At first, he thought he was just seeing things, maybe the dim lighting or a trick of his own anxious mind. But there she was, Amanda, standing off to the side near a set of folding chairs, dressed in a janitor's uniform. The gear in her hands and the caution sign near her feet spoke volumes about what she was doing there. He blinked, certain he'd made a mistake, but her face was unmistakable. She looked older, of course. Time had etched subtle lines around her eyes, and a weary sort of tiredness seemed to cling to her. But beneath it all, he still recognized the softness he'd fallen in love with so many years ago. In a flash, old memories came rushing back. He remembered the late-night talks about their future, the small gestures of kindness she always showed, and the fierce arguments that led to their separation. Guilt, regret, and an emotion he couldn't quite place all swirled together in his chest, making it hard to breathe. Then it happened. Amanda glanced up and her eyes locked with his. For a moment, everything else in that ornate ballroom faded away. The music, the chatter, the clinking of glasses. All he could see was the shock in her eyes, and all he could feel was the sharp twist of old wounds reopening. His fancy suit, the lavish wedding, and the inflated sense of pride he'd been carrying around suddenly felt worthless. It was like the very sight of Amanda tore down every illusion he'd built around his life. He stood there, drink in hand, not quite sure if he should approach or run away, but fully aware that fate had just dealt him a sobering reminder of everything he once lost. Nelson found a quiet corner to catch his breath, his heart pounding like he'd just run a marathon. Seeing Amanda again after all these years felt like a gut punch he never saw coming. Sure, he'd thought about her sometimes. Random flashes of memories would surface when he was alone in his penthouse, reminding him of simpler days. But actually laying eyes on her again in that unexpected moment left him dizzy with emotion. It was as though time had warped, bringing the teenage boy he used to be right to the forefront, showing him everything he threw away. He remembered the mornings when he'd wake up before dawn to help Amanda's dad fix up old cars in the backyard, making just enough money to fill up her family's pantry. He recalled sneaking into Amanda's room through the window once, just to surprise her with a flower he picked from her mom's garden. They laughed at how silly and romantic it was. Those were the moments he once considered worth more than all the gold in the world. Now, in this glamorous setting, he wondered if maybe he'd lost more than he gained. A swirl of guilt gnawed at him as he recalled how their relationship fell apart. His calls became less frequent, his visits even rarer. When Amanda questioned him about it, he spat out cruel words, resentful statements about how she didn't understand his ambitions, how he refused to be tied down. He shut her out, convinced that his new direction in life was more important. And here she was, presumably living a very different reality while he partied with the city's elite. He wondered what life had thrown at her, what challenges had worn her down. For the first time in a long while, Nelson felt a pang of regret so fierce he could barely stand. Amanda tried to keep her head down, avoiding any hint of interaction with the guests. It was clear she was there to work, not to mingle. Her worn-out eyes hinted at struggles Nelson couldn't even begin to imagine, and there was a certain guardedness in her posture. Like she'd learned the hard way not to trust the world too easily. Still, he couldn't ignore the slight bulge of her belly, an obvious sign that she was pregnant or at least had been recently. The sight hit him like a jolt, forcing him to confront questions he hadn't dared to consider before. Was she married now? Did she find the love she deserved? Or was life just piling on hardships? She moved across the room with quiet efficiency, wiping down tables and picking up stray napkins. A couple of guests shot her dismissive looks, the kind of condescension people show when they think they're above someone else's station. Nelson's blood boiled seeing that. Amanda didn't deserve their contempt. He remembered her resilience, the way she'd roll up her sleeves and get things done, never complaining. She was the kind of person who'd give you her last dollar if you needed it more than she did. Suddenly, he had a painful memory of the final days of their marriage, an argument that ended with him storming out. Amanda begged him to slow down, to consider starting a family, or at least to be present for the one they had planned. But he was too focused on chasing contracts and networking events. He couldn't be bothered with mundane life stuff, or at least that's how he saw it at the time. Looking at her now, he realized the toll his betrayal must have taken on her. The regret was so strong it practically formed a lump in his throat, leaving him feeling more vulnerable than he'd ever felt in his shiny, successful life. Summoning courage he wasn't sure he still possessed, Nelson set down his untouched drink on a nearby table and walked toward Amanda. Each step felt heavier than the last, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. Part of him wanted to run away, to retreat into the comfort of his well-curated life where he didn't have to face the mess he left behind. But he owed her this, at the very least, a conversation, an acknowledgement, maybe even an apology. When he finally stood close enough to speak, the words didn't come easily. Amanda paused, her eyes flicking up in surprise. For a split second, they just stared at each other, the air thick with everything left unsaid. He noticed how her hands tightened around the cleaning rag she was holding, knuckles turning white. It was as if she was bracing herself for a blow. He opened his mouth, trying to form a sentence, but all that came out was a shaky whisper of her name. Amanda! Her reaction was a mixture of shock and pain, etched so clearly on her face that Nelson felt guilt slice through him. She looked at him like a ghost from her past, a reminder of broken promises and love betrayed. He fought the urge to reach out and touch her arm, to reassure her that he wasn't that callous man anymore, only he wasn't entirely sure he'd changed. Instead, he stood there, awkward and exposed, the polished facade he wore so carefully in business settings nowhere to be found. Eventually, he managed to speak, words tumbling out clumsily. He told her he was sorry to see her under these circumstances, that he hoped she was okay. In that moment, the glitz of the wedding receded like background noise, and all that remained was the painful truth of two people forced to confront the history that bound them and broke them long ago. Amanda's gaze lingered on Nelson, and for a split second, he saw pure heartbreak in her eyes. It was like all those years apart came crashing into this single moment, ripping open wounds that never fully healed. She took a shaky breath, clearly fighting tears she refused to shed in front of these well-to-do wedding guests. In that look, he felt her disappointment, her anger, and maybe even a sliver of longing. It stung to realize how deeply he'd hurt her. He tried to apologize, really he did, but the words got tangled up in his throat. All he managed was a quiet, "I'm sorry," that barely scratched the surface of everything he'd done wrong. Amanda's face hardened, and she let out a bitter laugh. "You're sorry?" she repeated, her voice low. It wasn't a shriek or an angry outburst, just a whisper that cut deeper than any shout could. He braced himself, knowing he had it coming. She told him how she'd mailed him letters during their divorce proceedings. Letters filled with raw emotion and pleas for understanding, that he never bothered to read. She reminded him how he'd vanished after signing those final papers, leaving her to pick up the pieces alone. Her words sliced through the fancy atmosphere, making him feel painfully out of place in his tailored suit. He thought back to that time, how he'd buried himself in deals and negotiations to avoid facing guilt. Now, with Amanda standing right there, it was clear he could no longer run from his past. Amanda's voice shook with a mix of rage and sorrow. "You don't get to just pop back in and act like everything's fine." Every syllable was a reminder that he'd thrown away a woman who gave him her whole heart. Standing in front of her now, Nelson felt smaller than he ever had, and he knew that, for once, his money and success couldn't buy him an escape from the damage he'd caused. The sting in Amanda's voice was like ND. He couldn't help but recall the last conversation they had before she left for good. It was a heated argument that spiraled out of control, accusations about broken promises, about how he'd put money before her. He'd been so blinded by ambition that he said something along the lines of, "If you can't keep up with my life, then maybe you're not meant to be in it." Looking back, he wanted to punch himself for being so cruel. Standing here, he realized Amanda never truly recovered from those words. The pain etched on her face made it clear that time alone hadn't erased her hurt. He felt a wave of shame, remembering how he used to justify his actions by claiming he was doing it all for them. Truth was, the moment he got a taste of success, he forgot the very reasons he'd started chasing it in the first place. Amanda's accusations were pointed, her frustration coming out in hushed but forceful bursts. She accused him of chasing status, of forgetting his roots, and worst of all, forgetting her. She glared at him, tears pooling in the corners of her eyes as she hissed, "You pushed me away like I didn't matter." Her words were so thick with emotion he swore he could taste the salt of her tears in his own mouth. Nelson swallowed the lump in his throat, wanting to throw himself at her feet and beg for forgiveness. But there was no quick fix for the damage he'd done, no magic words to wipe away the memories of betrayal. A part of him wondered if this was just the beginning of a long-overdue reckoning, a chance to finally face the consequences of letting greed poison the one relationship he should have cherished the most. The wedding celebration carried on around them, laughing guests, waiters weaving through the crowd with fresh champagne, and the newlyweds taking endless selfies by a flower arch. Yet all Nelson could focus on was Amanda's pained expression. He plastered on a half-smile whenever someone glanced his way, but inside he was unraveling. For the first time in years, he wished the fancy suit and the big-shot persona would just fade away. He wanted to be the old Nelson, the kid who'd have given anything to protect Amanda. But he wasn't that kid anymore. He was a man who'd built his life on deals and negotiations, on forging relationships that advanced his social standing rather than fed his soul. Publicly, he was a success story, a ruggedly handsome entrepreneur who'd clawed his way up from nothing. He'd faced countless interviews and photo ops, always exuding confidence and charm. Behind that polished exterior, though, was a heart that had never stopped aching for what he lost. Amanda, on the other hand, had no time for illusions. She'd learned the hard way that words and promises could be hollow. As he searched her face for even a glimpse of softness, he found only a steely resolve. It was a reminder that while he'd been busy climbing the corporate ladder, she'd been busy surviving on her own. He wanted to reach out and tell her she was still the only thing that ever truly mattered, but even he knew how hollow that would sound now. As the music shifted to a slow ballad, couples drifted onto the dance floor. Nelson saw the bride and groom swaying in blissful ignorance of the drama unfolding in the corner. He realized that was him once. Oblivious and in love, thinking nothing could ever tear them apart. Now he felt trapped by his own choices. With the bright lights swirling and well-dressed guests dancing, Nelson's smile felt more like a mask he'd grown too tired to wear. Back in the day, Amanda was more than just his wife. She was his partner in everything. She'd proofread his proposals when he was applying for grants and small business loans. She'd stay up late helping him crunch numbers, making sure each dime was accounted for so he could stretch a tiny startup budget as far as possible. And she never once complained about the frugal meals or the ragged clothes because she knew he was saving every extra cent for the business. She believed in him with a steadfastness he sometimes found startling. That was then. Tonight, as he stood before her in this extravagant setting, Nelson couldn't help but feel that she'd been an essential part of his transformation from a scrappy nobody into someone with real influence. She'd been there for every success and every failure until he shut her out. It occurred to him that maybe fate had been a lot kinder to him than he deserved, giving him Amanda's unwavering support at a time when he had nothing else. His mind flashed back to the day he closed his first substantial deal. He'd come home carrying a cheap bottle of champagne, the best he could afford back then, and Amanda hugged him so tight he could barely breathe. Her eyes shone with pride, and in that moment he felt like the richest man in the world. Even though his bank account didn't quite agree. They toasted to the future, to the family they'd one day build. Now, that vision felt like a dream from a lifetime ago. Everything had unraveled. The marriage, the partnership, the warmth he once took for granted. He'd torn it all down in his pursuit of more. All he had left was the hollow ring of success echoing in his penthouse. But standing here, confronted with Amanda's weary eyes and guarded stance, he felt an odd glimmer of hope. Maybe this meeting wasn't pure coincidence. Maybe it was the universe telling him it was time to face the music and own up to the mistakes that had cost him the one person who truly mattered. Nelson couldn't help but remember how their love story started with such promise. Back when they were teenagers, they were that adorable couple everyone envied, holding hands as they strolled through the dusty roads, giggling at inside jokes and daydreaming about a future that felt wide open. They'd talk about traveling, about raising a couple of kids who'd never have to know the weight of poverty, about maybe opening a small business together so they could keep family and work intertwined. There was a fire in both of them, a mutual desire to rise above their circumstances without losing each other. But as soon as Nelson landed in the city, the cracks formed. He got a taste of the high life, expensive suits, glossy boardrooms, and influential people who'd pat him on the back when he brokered a big deal. Amanda, for her part, tried to keep up, relocating and taking on menial jobs to be closer to him. Over time, though, she realized she wasn't living her own dream, she was riding shotgun on Nelson's. The tension grew, and with every new rung he climbed, he seemed to drift further from her. Family dinner dates gave way to business dinners, heartfelt chats gave way to short, rushed phone calls. It was a slow decay that neither of them fully acknowledged until it was too late. When their marriage collapsed, they were left with a bitter taste in their mouths. Amanda felt betrayed by a man who'd promised her the moon but delivered heartbreak instead. Nelson, convinced he was doing the right thing, justified his actions by pointing to his bank statements as if more zeros could replace genuine affection. Both were too proud, too hurt to find middle ground. Watching her now, the love story they once cherished felt like a shattered relic. Yet the depth of their pain also hinted at the depth of their bond. There was a time when they were each other's world. If they still felt this much, maybe that world wasn't beyond saving, if only they could put the pieces back together. Tori, the bride, was an interesting figure in this complicated puzzle. She wasn't just any bride, she was the daughter of a wealthy tycoon with connections so vast they practically stretched across continents. Nelson had known about her upcoming nuptials for months, but he saw it mostly as a chance to network, lock down deals, and appear in the right circles. He never imagined it'd be the setting where he'd come face to face with his past. And Tori had her own backstory. Her father was the kind of man who struck fear into competitors just by mentioning his name. He was a ruthless negotiator with an uncanny ability to sense weakness in any adversary. Growing up under that shadow, Tori had learned to be strategic in her relationships, especially in matters of business. She'd reached out to Nelson a while back, offering him a seat at the table on a lucrative new project, one that came with hefty profits and, apparently, a few buried secrets. At first, Nelson didn't question it. After all, the money was good and Tori had a knack for making deals that seemed too sweet to pass up. But there were rumors floating around. Some said Tori was deeply in debt before her father bailed her out. Others claimed she had a hand in questionable schemes. Things like setting up fall guys, forging documents, and manipulating numbers to hide her tracks. Nelson shrugged off the gossip, figuring high society was always crawling with jealousy-fueled lies. But now, seeing the way Tori maneuvered through her own wedding, plastering on that radiant bride smile, he wondered if there was more to the rumors than he initially believed. Little did he know the tangled threads of Tori's life were about to intersect with Amanda's story. Hidden motives, stolen money, and a twisted sense of loyalty would soon come to light. What started as a simple wedding celebration might just blow open a dark secret that had forced Nelson to question every alliance he'd built in his climb to the top. The wedding reception kicked into high gear, with music throbbing from the speakers and guests eagerly sharing photos and videos on social media. Nelson drifted through the crowd, exchanging polite nods and half-smiles with business associates. Yet, every few minutes, his eyes would wander back to Amanda, who was doing her best to remain invisible behind the scenes. The weight of unresolved tension pressed down on them both, and he could sense that confrontation was inevitable. Up on the stage, Tori's new husband toasted to their future together, praising her beauty and charm for all the guests to hear. She blushed prettily, but Nelson, watching from afar, couldn't help noticing a shadow pass over her face. It was gone in an instant, replaced by that perfect, practiced grin. He wondered if anyone else caught it, if anyone else sensed the quiet tension simmering beneath the glitzy surface of this event. There was a moment when Tori slipped away from her own reception, ducking into a side hallway where she thought no one was watching. Nelson happened to be standing nearby, and he caught a glimpse of the intense phone call she was having. She looked angry, hissing into her phone in a tone far removed from the cheerful bride act she'd been putting on. He couldn't catch every word, but he heard enough to know it involved money, missing money, to be exact, and something about making sure that woman stayed out of sight. Curiosity gnawed at him, but so did a strange feeling of dread. As the newlyweds were called back to cut the cake, Tori re-emerged into the ballroom, all smiles and grace. The guests cheered, cameras flashed, and the band kicked up a celebratory tune. Yet, for Nelson, the enchantment had faded. He had a suspicion that something very wrong was about to unfold, and Amanda, somehow, was caught in the crossfire. The night's shadows stretched over the celebration, hinting at secrets waiting to burst into the limelight. Nelson had spent most of his adult life steering clear of messy confrontations in public settings. It just wasn't good for business, or so he always told himself. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was the guilt gnawing at him from seeing Amanda, or the nagging sense that Tori was hiding something that directly affected Amanda's hardships. Either way, something snapped in him when he overheard Tori's sharp-toned phone call. He decided right then and there that he couldn't just swallow his doubts and play nice for the crowd. He made his way to the microphone stand near the stage. Waiters scurried around, trying to serve dessert, and a few guests eyed him curiously, wondering if he was about to give a toast. This wasn't exactly a planned speech, but Nelson took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and tapped the mic. The sound reverberated through the speakers, catching everyone's attention. Conversations died down, and all eyes turned to him. Tori, in her extravagant wedding gown, stood frozen, her expression shifting from surprise to apprehension. Nelson cleared his throat, his heart hammering in his chest. He glanced at Amanda, who stood off to the side with the same stunned look as everyone else. Then he let the words spill out. He started with a polite congratulations to the newlyweds, but there was tension in his voice that made the room grow still. He talked vaguely about how the road to true success isn't just about accumulating wealth and throwing lavish parties, it's about integrity and honesty even when nobody's looking. People began whispering, sensing that this was no ordinary toast. Nelson felt a surge of nerves. Normally, he was a smooth talker in boardrooms, but this was raw, unplanned, and bursting with emotion he could hardly control. Still, he pressed on. Tonight, he wasn't going to hide behind polite smiles. He was going to confront the lies, no matter how many VIPs were watching. A hush settled over the ballroom as Nelson tightened his grip on the microphone. He pointedly turned his gaze to Tori, feeling the collective breath of the crowd hitch in anticipation. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't have to. The intensity in his words spoke volumes. "I'm sorry to hijack this celebration," he said, swallowing his nerves, "but there's something here that needs to be addressed." He locked eyes with Tori, whose forced smile wavered. He went on to accuse her of orchestrating a scheme that not only framed Amanda but also funneled money away from various accounts, money that Tori had siphoned off to fund her lavish lifestyle and to keep her father's suspicions at bay. You could almost feel the shock ripple through the guests. Cameras stopped clicking, forks were placed gently down on dessert plates. Tori stood rooted to the spot, her face paling with each accusation Nelson hurled her way. He described how Amanda, once tied to Nelson's life, had unknowingly become a scapegoat. Her name appeared on documents implying she'd taken funds from one of Nelson's companies, leading to legal woes and a smear campaign that left her reputation and finances in tatters. Though details were sketchy, Nelson had pieced together enough from various sources to suspect that Tori was the puppeteer pulling the strings behind the scenes. And now, with adrenaline coursing through him, he was exposing it all. Gasps erupted from the crowd, and Tori's family looked around in confusion, some in outright denial. Tori opened her mouth as if to defend herself, but she couldn't form the words. Nelson's boldness stunned everyone, including Amanda, who stood there looking torn between gratitude and shock. After all these years, Nelson was stepping up, maybe a little late, but better late than never, to clear her name and unmask the true culprit. Whether this was redemption or just a messy start to something bigger, nobody in that room would ever forget this explosive moment. All eyes snapped to Tori, and in that charged second, the entire wedding reception seemed to hang in limbo. Her perfect bridal makeup couldn't hide the wave of panic rolling across her face. She tried to regain her composure, tossing her hair over her shoulder with a shaky laugh. "Nelson, I don't know what you're talking about," she said, voice trembling. "This is ridiculous. Why would I frame someone I barely know?" Her claim hung in the air, unconvincing at best. But Nelson wasn't having it. He called out specific dates and sums money that vanished mysteriously right after Tori had authorized a fund transfer. He pointed out inconsistencies in the story she fed him months ago about a business expansion. Each fact cut through Tori's flimsy denials like a blade. The more he spoke, the more her facade began to crack. She glanced around the room, eyes flicking to her father, who stood in shocked disbelief. The bride's white gown and elaborate veil suddenly looked like a costume worn to hide something much darker beneath. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and Tori's once adoring audience started shifting uncomfortably. Her new husband looked at her with a mixture of horror and confusion, as if he couldn't believe this was the woman he'd just promised to love and cherish. It dawned on him and everyone else that Tori's wedding might not be the only thing she'd staged so carefully. The sweet, wide-eyed bride routine was cracking under the weight of Nelson's accusations. Finally, Tori's composure shattered. Tears sprang to her eyes, smudging the mascara on her cheeks. She stammered a desperate denial, but it was too late. The seeds of doubt had been planted in everyone's mind. Her carefully cultivated image was crumbling, leaving her vulnerable for the first time in front of a crowd that had gathered to celebrate her. And that was the moment everyone realized this wasn't just a wedding gone wrong, it was the unveiling of a twisted drama years in the making. Tori stood there, tears trailing dark lines down her cheeks as the crowd looked on in silent astonishment. Nobody knew quite what to do. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, yet here she was, accused of orchestrating a scheme that had cost an innocent woman her reputation. Her voice cracked when she finally managed to speak, and she sounded more defeated than defensive. "I never wanted this," she blurted, staring first at Nelson, then at Amanda, and finally at her father, who wore a look of pure disappointment. She confessed, in halting sobs, that she'd felt trapped under the weight of her family's expectations. Her father had always demanded nothing short of perfection, so when Tori messed up, accruing debt and making bad business decisions, she panicked. Rather than risk losing her father's favor, she chose a darker path. She sniffled, tears pooling in her eyes, and admitted that she'd learned of Amanda through old records Nelson hadn't fully scrubbed from his files. She manipulated those records, framing Amanda for stolen funds. She reasoned that no one would bother digging deeper into the story of a discarded ex-wife from a small town. It was all about self-preservation. Tori needed someone else to take the fall for her own financial misdeeds. The desperation and fear of losing her father's respect clouded her better judgment, making her believe that sacrificing Amanda's good name was a lesser evil than facing her own family's wrath. Her confession landed like a bomb, sending waves of shock through the reception hall. Some guests looked appalled, others sympathetic. The bride they thought they knew was, in fact, a deeply troubled woman who'd let her fears turn her into a perpetrator of deceit. A hush fell over the crowd. Even the band had quieted, their instruments in limbo, as if they too were paralyzed by the gravity of Tori's words. Amanda, her eyes glassy with hurt, seemed lost for words, while Nelson felt a strange mixture of anger and pity for the woman whose perfect life was now crumbling faster than anyone could have imagined. After Tori's startling confession, the whole reception fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Some guests discreetly gathered their coats, trying to slip out without drawing attention. Others stood rooted in place, unable to tear themselves away from the unfolding drama. It felt like the grand ballroom had turned into a stage for a Shakespearean tragedy, complete with betrayal, broken hearts, and the Amanda, who clutched her janitor's uniform like it was a protective shield. He saw more than just shock on her face, he saw heartbreak. In that moment, he understood that while Tori had manipulated Amanda's reputation, Nelson himself had manipulated Amanda's trust and love. The realization cut deeper than he expected. She'd lost years of her life to shame, struggling to clear her name and survive, all while he'd been winning awards, attending galas, and growing his fortune. A stabbing guilt made him wonder, if he'd stayed with Amanda, would any of this have happened? Would Tori have found another scapegoat, or would Amanda have never been on her radar? It was impossible to say, but the questions haunted him. While Tori's betrayal was blatant, Nelson recognized that his abandonment was a betrayal too, one that stretched back years. He'd left Amanda alone to weather storms that neither of them could have predicted. He swallowed hard, wrestling with a flood of emotions. For the first time in a while, money felt utterly meaningless. He thought about the missed birthdays, the anniversaries that passed without a single phone call, the nights Amanda probably cried herself to sleep because of him. Yet here he was, in a custom suit, about to head back to a lavish penthouse, while Amanda was wearing a janitor's uniform. He wondered if the damage was beyond repair or if, by some grace, they could mend what had been torn apart by greed, lies, and lost time. Amanda took a shaky step forward, her eyes flicking between Tori, who was sobbing softly, and Nelson, who stood there looking like a man on the brink of realization. She cleared her throat, voice trembling but steady enough to command the crowd's attention. It was a surreal sight, this woman who'd been mopping floors a moment ago now standing before a room full of wealthy socialites and calling out the truth. She began by explaining her own journey. After Nelson left, she tried to stay afloat by juggling multiple low-paying jobs. Then, out of the blue, she was slapped with allegations of embezzlement tied to a company Nelson was involved with. From that moment on, her life spiraled into court dates, drained bank accounts, and a tarnished reputation she struggled to rebuild. Yet, through it all, she never once tried to contact Nelson for help, partially because of the pride she had left but mostly because she believed he wouldn't care. Amanda's voice trembled when she described the pain of being pregnant with no one to lean on, having to make heart-wrenching decisions just to ensure her baby's well-being. She shared how she sold off most of her belongings, took on overnight cleaning shifts, and cut corners wherever she could, all while her stomach grew and her energy waned. She told them that every sacrifice, the exhaustion, the mental toll, the public scorn, was driven by a fierce desire to stand on her own 2 feet, even if it meant barely surviving. By the time she finished, tears shimmered in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She stood resolute, not pleading for sympathy but demanding a recognition of her truth. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint buzzing of the overhead lights. In that silence, Amanda's strength shone brighter than any chandelier. She'd sacrificed nearly everything she had, her comfort, her pride, her future with Nelson to maintain her integrity. And now finally, the world could see she'd never been the villain in this twisted story. Nelson felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. Amanda's words tore through every carefully constructed illusion he'd built about why their marriage failed and how they drifted apart. He always told himself she was better off without him, that she'd move on and find happiness somewhere else. But hearing her speak so plainly about her struggles made him confront just how thoroughly he'd abandoned her. He remembered the day he'd arrogantly thrown some cutting remark at her, something along the lines of how she was holding him back. She'd stood there, tears in her eyes, watching him storm out. He'd hopped on a flight the next morning for a business trip, never bothering to call. When he returned, divorce papers were in the works and he'd signed them without a second thought, telling himself it was simpler that way. Now he realized the weight of those words and actions had stayed with Amanda long after he'd walked away. The entire ballroom watched as Nelson's stoic facade cracked. For all his success, money, and influence, he was still just a man haunted by the pain he'd caused. He took a shaky step toward Amanda, not sure if she'd welcome him or shove him away. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, voice thick with regret. He wanted to gather her into his arms and promise he'd make it all right, but he couldn't ignore the fact that he was years too late. The illusions of who he was and what he'd achieved shattered at his feet. He wasn't just a self-made success story, he was also the guy who'd pushed away someone who truly loved him. And now he was seeing, in stark reality, that no trophy or bank balance could make up for a family lost. The question that hung in the air was whether Amanda could ever forgive him or if his apologies were just another moment too little, too late. The reaction from the crowd was a strange mix of awe, discomfort, and pity. A man who'd built his life on the praise of others now found himself laid bare, every personal failing exposed under glaring chandeliers. It was a public reckoning, and no one in that grand ballroom would ever see Nelson or Amanda the same way again. Some turned their faces away, either out of respect or embarrassment for him. Others looked on curiously, almost as if they were waiting for the next act in a drama they couldn't tear themselves away from. Nelson cleared his throat, forcing his voice to stay steady. "I've hurt you," he said, looking directly at Amanda. "I put money and ambition before everything, before us. That was my greatest mistake. And if it's not too late, I want to fix this. I don't expect you to trust me, but I'll spend every day trying to make things right." It felt weird to bare his soul with so many eyes on him, but he owed her that honesty. The band, unsure how to proceed, simply stood by as waitstaff quietly placed desserts and coffees on tables, though hardly anyone was in the mood to eat. Tori stood off to the side, trembling as her new husband tried to console her, but it looked like their marriage had cracked on day one. Her father wore a look that mingled anger and shame in equal measure. The entire event was unraveling into something nobody could have predicted. Amanda took a breath, glancing at the swirling gowns, the champagne flutes left half empty, the disapproving looks from the city's elite. Then, turning back to Nelson, she spoke softly, her voice carrying a weight that seemed to echo in the hushed room. "I don't need speeches," she said. "I need to see actions." With that, she took a step back as if to suggest that no matter how heartfelt his words were, they weren't enough to heal the wounds he'd caused. Nelson nodded, tears burning in his eyes, realizing in that moment that humility might be the only path he had left. A few minutes later, the tension in the room was so thick you could feel it in the air. Nelson knew he had a decision to make, a turning point that would define the rest of his life. He glanced around at the glittering display of wealth and prestige, at the acquaintances who'd treated him like a superstar as long as his wallet was thick, and realized just how empty it all felt now. He didn't just want to apologize to Amanda, he wanted to prove that he'd learned something from all this. Summoning the last of his courage, he walked to where Amanda stood, ignoring the questioning looks from everyone else. He leaned in, lowering his voice, and said something he'd never allowed himself to say before, "I'm leaving all this. It doesn't matter anymore if I don't have a family to share it with." In that instant, he understood that the mansion, the business empire, and the admiration of strangers meant nothing compared to the chance of rebuilding what he once threw away. A hush fell over the crowd again as Nelson did something no one expected. He removed his fancy suit jacket, loosened his tie, and set them aside like he was shedding an old skin he no longer wanted to inhabit. The The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. It was a silent statement that the man who cared so much about outward appearances was, at last, ready to step away from the illusion. Amanda looked at him, uncertainty clear in her eyes. Could she trust him? Could she believe that he'd actually abandoned the glittering life he once craved? She didn't have the answer right then, and Nelson didn't blame her. But he made his intentions clear. He was willing to leave everything behind. His brand new deals, the social circles that stroked his ego, and even his precious penthouse if it meant there was a chance to mend the broken pieces of their once beautiful life. He hoped with all his heart that Amanda might someday see he was serious. With the entire room still processing this whirlwind of revelations, Nelson gently took Amanda's hand. The shock on her face said it all. She never expected him to do that, especially not here, surrounded by Tori's influential guests. But he had no more interest in keeping up appearances. He'd finally decided to walk away from the shallow world he'd built. Together, they moved toward the exit, each step drawing whispers from all corners of the ballroom. It felt like time slowed down, the crowd parting like waves around them. Nelson didn't bother looking back. He didn't need to see the final expressions on the faces of people who'd once toasted his success. Their opinions were no longer the air he breathed. In that moment, the only thing that mattered was Amanda. She hesitated when they reached the big, ornate doors. Turning back, she briefly locked eyes with Tori, whose tear-streaked face held a complicated mix of guilt and sorrow. The bride's perfect white gown was stained with the weight of her own choices. Amanda gave Tori one last look, less a glare and more a resigned acknowledgement that they'd both played roles in this twisted game of money and betrayal. Then, without a word, Amanda slipped her arm through Nelson's. They stepped out into the cool night air, leaving behind the echoes of music, clinking glasses, and gossiping guests. Out here, beneath the stars, it was quieter. The city's hum still surrounded them, but the harsh glare of the chandeliers and the prying eyes of the elite were gone. Nelson breathed deeply, tasting the crisp freedom in the air. Amanda looked up at him, her face still etched with caution, but there was the faintest flicker of hope. That single flicker felt like a promise of something new, a chance to rewrite the ending that once seemed so tragically final. And while neither of them knew what the future held, they both sensed that leaving the past behind was their first real step forward. They walked for a while, hands occasionally brushing but not fully entwined. Amanda, torn between lingering resentment and cautious optimism, listened as Nelson poured out a heartfelt explanation of what he planned to do next. He vowed to dismantle the empire he'd built on shaky morals, at least the parts that didn't align with true integrity. He mentioned wanting to offer restitution to those who'd been wronged, including a public statement clearing Amanda's name once and for all. It wouldn't be simple. Contracts were signed, deals were in motion, and an entire network of powerful people might turn against him the moment he showed weakness. But Nelson knew this wasn't about preserving relationships built on ego. It was about doing what was right, even if it meant starting from scratch. He admitted he was scared, terrified, actually, of losing everything he'd spent his adult life building. But he was even more terrified of losing Amanda again, this time for good. Amanda listened carefully, her silence speaking volumes. She was no stranger to hardship, having faced it head-on for years. Part of her wanted to scoff at his sudden change of heart, questioning whether it was just guilt fueling this newfound sense of righteousness. But there was another part of her, a tender spot that remembered the boy who used to bring her wildflowers, who'd spend hours talking about changing the world in some small, meaningful way. She didn't say she believed him entirely, but she also didn't say she didn't. That cautious middle ground was enough for now. Redemption, she realized, wasn't a quick fix. It was a slow, messy process that required consistent effort. Maybe Nelson would slip up, maybe they'd fight. But if he was willing to own his mistakes and put genuine effort into repairing the damage, there might be a chance. The path ahead was steep and uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, they were walking on it together. Over the next few weeks, Nelson found himself navigating a whole new reality. He resigned from certain boards, backed out of questionable deals, and even sat down with lawyers to make sure Amanda's name was officially cleared of any wrongdoing. It was a far cry from the life he was used to, no more lavish parties, no more constant phone calls from corporate big shots. Suddenly, he had more free time than he knew what to do with, and he poured most of that time into reconnecting with Amanda. They really talked, for the first time in years. At her modest apartment, they'd sit on a worn-out couch, sipping cheap coffee and hashing out old hurts. She didn't hold back in reminding him of all the ways he'd broken her trust, and he didn't shy away from taking responsibility. It was painful, but also strangely cathartic. Little by little, they laughed over memories of simpler times, recalling moments that felt like a distant dream. She'd tease him about his early business schemes, how he once tried to sell homemade lemonade in repurposed bottles, and he'd grin, remembering how she helped design the labels. There were still moments of tension, especially when they talked about the money he'd spent on frivolities while she struggled to make rent. Guilt gnawed at him, and more than once he found himself apologizing. But those moments gave way to glimmers of something that felt like hope. Together, they visited doctors' offices to check on Amanda's pregnancy, discovering that her child was healthy despite the overwhelming stress she'd endured. Nelson awkwardly asked if he could help with baby items, offering to pay for a crib or diapers, but Amanda insisted on meeting him halfway, maintaining her independence. As the weeks rolled by, they started forging new promises. The old vows they once shared might have been broken, but a fresh commitment was taking shape, one built on honesty, humility, and the bond that, despite everything, still lingered between them. Several months later, the baby's cries echoed in a small but cozy room where Amanda and Nelson found themselves cradling a tiny bundle of life. The tension of hospital bills and day-to-day expenses still existed, but their perspective on wealth had changed drastically. Gone were the days when Nelson measured success by the size of his bank account or the exclusivity of his social circle. Now, success looked like a healthy child, a roof over their heads, and the fragile but growing sense of unity between him and Amanda. He'd sold off a big chunk of his holdings, using the proceeds to not only settle debts but also to establish a fund to help people like Amanda, people who'd fallen through the cracks due to the manipulations of the rich and powerful. It was a small step toward making amends, and it didn't erase all his mistakes, but it was a start. There was still legal fallout from exposing Tori's schemes. She faced multiple lawsuits and public backlash, her father stepping down from certain positions to dodge the scandal. The city buzzed with rumors about how Nelson had lost his edge, how he'd gone soft. But oddly enough, he'd never felt more at peace. One evening, Amanda found Nelson on the porch of their modest home, staring at the stars the way he used to back in their dusty hometown. She wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and asked if he missed the penthouse, the parties, the high-profile deals. He glanced at her, at their little baby sleeping inside, at the life they were slowly rebuilding, and shook his head. "Those things don't matter anymore," he whispered, pulling her closer. In that simple moment, he realized he'd finally learned the true cost of greed. It had taken losing everything, his marriage, his integrity, his sense of purpose, before he could understand that real wealth wasn't about numbers in a bank account or your reputation among the elite. It was about love, family, and being able to look at yourself in the mirror without shame. And in that sense, Nelson was richer now than he'd ever been in his entire life.